A prophet is somebody who embodies that which is prophetic. Let's go ahead and define a couple terms. There are people who have the gift of prophecy, or they're able to give words of knowledge, or they're able to, in the charismatic / Pentecostal wording, read your mail. That is not the definition of a prophet. There is an entire perspective, an entire perception by which we understand, or we're supposed to understand, the framework of the scripture. It embodies covenant, it embodies eternality. When you think of the prophet Jeremiah and how God charges that the false prophets did not stand in his counsel, he asks the question, who has stood in my counsel? These are people who have been radically changed by experience, and that the experience that they have gone through has caused for them to understand reality in a much different way than the majority of people do. So what that then means in translation is the way that they speak is that they are bringing the people back to the alignment with reality through covenant and through God. In the Old Testament, they wouldn't have used the phrase of through Christ, but ultimately that's what we would understand it to be, is that this is the framework by which God is interacting with the world and with his people. And this is what then is proclaimed unto Israel. Oftentimes that comes across as diagnosis. Sometimes it comes across as, here is what is going to end up happening because of the way that you are. And here's God's ultimate plan of restoration and redemption. Isaiah 2:1 struck me one day, where it said the word of the Lord that Isaiah saw. And when you think of words, you hear them. If you see a word, it's like it's written, right? But that's not the way that it explains it in Isaiah 2. And there are other places through the Bible where it seems like they are stretching language to try to explain an experience that they've had. It's not just a vision. It's not just a theophany where they behold God or the throne. It's not just a matter of they get this word and it gets channeled through them and they're an oracle of some sort. There's something else that happens. The prophet is defined by standing within the counsel of God, not going and visiting, but who has stood in my counsel. That's a matter of encounter within the throne room. The prophet stands where we are told in Ephesians that we are seated with Christ in heavenly places. So for the prophet, and I would also think the apostles, the prophet is someone who is radically altered in their perception and in their words and in the way that they perceive all things by an encounter, whether that's hearing their name called out, whether that's a vision, whether that's they receive an audible word. There aren't specific parameters to say that the encounter has to be a specific thing, just that they end up encountering God in such a way that they cannot just keep on going life as it is. They now have something that they got to say, and it's like a fire in their bones. They got to get it out. It's a message, and it's not only a message of here's what's going to happen. It's a message of here is what God is like, and here's how you're not understanding. It's interesting that we think the prophets are the ones who are emotional or overzealous. We read their language, we think it's hyperbolic, we think it's extreme. But when you really stop and just ask the question of, is it really extreme? Is it really hyperbole? You're forced to have to then bring up categories of, are the prophets emotional or are they speaking for God? If they're speaking what God thinks, then you're now calling God emotional and God hyperbolic. The language is extreme sometimes. They've got extreme zeal and fervor. They can't stop prophesying. It is locked up like a fire in the bones, is what Jeremiah says. And we oftentimes end up reducing that into, well, we don't feel like that. This isn't a feeling that we get. Why are they so intense? So I want you to just imagine this. Imagine if you saw God. Imagine if God's voice spoke to you audibly. Imagine if you saw the full weight and glory. Imagine if you stood in that council. How would you be affected? Would you be able to stand at all? what do you think would happen to you? That's going to change your speech. It's going to change your lifestyle. It's going to change your outlook on life. It's going to change your outlook on how things work around you. You will not be the same person. Why is it that they have so much zeal? It's because they have so much proximity to the throne. Certainly the prophets do predict. You have Isaiah who is calling out that there will be a virgin who gives birth 800 years before the Christ is born. But there are a lot of scriptures where it doesn't seem like they're really prophesying, they're diagnosing, they're interpreting the times even. They're standing as watchmen guarding the people so that when they see things are entering into the body of Messiah, into God's people, Israel, whoever it might be, they are diagnosing these are things that are against the way that God has asked us to live. And they are causing for these types of realities being manifest, such as oppression of the poor, in slavery. They'll show that sacrifices that are being offered are illegitimate. These are not necessarily the things that the prophets are attacking. These are the symptoms that there's something wrong. And the prophet is identifying what it is that's wrong that has led to these symptoms. And he is showing, if you go back to Leviticus 26, if you go back to Deuteronomy 28, if you go back to Deuteronomy 30 through 32, there is a clear pattern that is given saying, if you do not follow the Lord, here are the consequences. But if you will turn back, here is what happens. If you don't turn back, here are the sharper consequences. And oftentimes, the prophets are interpreting history through that lens of, if we do not continue to hear his voice and hearken to him and follow the Lord and trust the Lord, the result is going to be covenant discipline. And so while there are indeed prophecies, and prophets do indeed see time completely differently than what you or I would look at it, that doesn't then mean that everything that the prophet says is specifically prophecy in the sense of they hear something and then speak it. I think that there's a real sense in which the way that they understand and perceive through covenant embodiment and covenant perspective, they can then interpret the times of the seasons and the time, think of Jesus's claim against the Pharisees. They can interpret the times and the seasons, but they don't know what's happening in front of them right now. It's not that the prophet can see every single thing that happens and say, oh, this is what's going on, and they just interpret every event. But when they interpret events, look at the way they interpret it. Oftentimes it is through covenant, and because you have not trusted the Lord, because you have trusted in the arm of the flesh, you've trusted the chariots of Egypt, here's the consequence that's coming. And it always, almost always, I would be willing to say always, but I don't have so much confidence to say that I have it all memorized, but I am certain that always, if not almost always, it is covenantally interpreted. And so the judgments that unfold, that they prophesy and predict, are the exact same things that were told to them in the book of the law. The prophet does not look at time linearly. We think of beginning, middle, end. There's a timeline, a sequence of events. The prophet doesn't look in that. They look at patterns. You can see repetitions of the exact same cycles over and over and over again. You have, we'll call it stasis. This is where Israel is in the land and in obedience. And then there's rebellion. After rebellion, there are prophets who continue to call the people back. When they continue to rebel, there's eventually exile. After there's exile, the people call on the name of the Lord, eventually recognizing their sins, and the Lord hears their cry and brings them back to the land. And so there's restoration and there's redemption. And then it goes back to that stasis, is what we'll call it for lack of a better word. That is not a linear track of time. That's cyclical time, meaning the same pattern can be spoken to across all eras and all epochs. When Isaiah is speaking to the people, as opposed to Elijah, or as opposed to Jeremiah or Ezekiel, as opposed to Daniel the prophet, as opposed to Zechariah, who's with the second temple, the reason they can have a coherency and their prophecies often mirror each other and build upon one another, is because they are seeing time in an eternal dynamic where they don't look at it as just one big long event of here's what's going to happen. There's a recapitulation of events. They continue to build toward each other. There's a trajectory that we're ultimately going to where Messiah comes and there's the kingdom of God established and all of the nations flood to Jerusalem to honor God, and they clutch to the skirt of the Jew, as it says in Zechariah, because they know God. They've seen him. This is how we get things like already not yet. That's the idea that yes, there are prophecies who have been fulfilled now, but it's not yet ultimately fulfilled. So yes, the kingdom of God is broken in now. Yes, we are seated with Christ in heavenly places now. Yes, we have the dynamic of the inheritance now. But that doesn't mean that Christ has not come back with his reward in hand. It doesn't mean that we are not going to gain an inheritance after this. You can have both. And the prophets lived in that dimension because they didn't see time as just step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. They saw it as here's the trajectory that continues to repeat until it finally consummates. The prophet is someone who stands within the counsel of God. That space is a sacred space. We can trace this idea of sacred space from Eden, where God walked, to Sinai, where God came down on Sinai. We could see it, was it Israel or was it Jacob, who realized that God was present and he didn't know? We can think of the tabernacle. We can think of the pillar in the cloud through the wilderness. The temple was filled with God's glory. These are sacred space. This is where God dwells. And so the reason why the prophets are zealous over the dwelling space, this sacred space, Zion, the New Jerusalem, the temple, the reason that they're so devastated when the glory departs, as Ezekiel saw in his visions, it is a matter of they understand the ramifications and the gravity of the situation, that as God continues to pull back further and further and further until he finally departs, this is a statement of the alignment of all things, that creation itself is even groaning that God would restore it all, because God's dwelling is the imperative end goal. He is wanting to dwell with his people and within his people. That's even back in the book of Exodus, that he says, I will be in their midst, not in the tabernacle, but I will dwell among them, the people. The prophet is incredibly zealous for God's presence and for him to not be offended and not have to recoil his presence. I think the best place to look for the definition of false prophets is when you go back to Moses' words, that he says you need to test them, you need to test their words, and you need to test whether they're leading you astray. So if somebody's prophesying falsely, that's the first step, right? That's the obvious one. Secondly, if they're prophesying in a way that is contradictory to the covenant. So if covenant says, if you're performing these actions, here are the repercussions, and they're saying peace, peace, that's not true. So while they might be prophesying peace, peace, and in that moment you don't know if it's true or false, in one sense you can be discerning and say, well, according to the covenant that Moses spoke and what God declared will be what happens if we're in this place, I can look around and see we do oppress the poor. I can look around and say we're not offering the sacrifices like we ought to be offering. I can see we're not in covenant obedience, ultimately is what I'm trying to get at. And because we as a people are not in covenant obedience, there is a real sense in which we should have covenant discipline. That alone will eliminate a lot of false prophets. The reason why people listen to false prophets and believe in false prophets is not because they're true. It's because they speak what we want to hear. It is a much happier thing to hear God is on your side than to hear God is going to leave this place. And the biggest question that God asks Jeremiah is, who has stood in my counsel? As if you can just come to this conclusion through reading the covenant and reading the scriptures and think, well, because I've got a gift of discernment, I'm going to go ahead and just start prophesying. It's not how this works. There is a legitimate place from which you are perceiving and hearing that leads you to this understanding, much past what just a basic discernment is ever going to give you. And the biggest thing I think here is the fruit of that. When you stand within the counsel of God, you're just a different caliber of mankind. You bear the marks within your own body and within your own history. The man is the message. When you speak a word, you have had to have that word break upon yourself. It has broken your own fallowed ground. You have had to identify the places in yourself that your sin is the exact same sin that Israel is repeating right now. And you've had to uproot that. And you've had to come to the diagnosis of here's where it's at. Through the Spirit, not just on your own, but by the Spirit's guiding, you have found the exact same words that you're speaking unto this generation as the words that have broken upon yourself while you have stood in the counsel of God. And so therefore the words that you speak have power past just the words themselves, because you are an embodiment of those words. Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. The prophetic is not silliness. It's not preaching. It's not speaking harshly. It's not seeing visions. It's not prophesying events. It's not trying to interpret the events of history. We can go through all of the things that prophecy is not. Ultimately, without pointing to any names, this is across all denominational spectrums. If someone gets identified as a prophet, the things that I would be looking for: covenant alignment. Are they speaking covenantally? Because if their prophecies are just words of knowledge, or reading your mail, or telling you these events are going to happen, like you're going to go get breakfast, you're going to see this, and the guy's going to give you $100, or whatever it is that they say, but there's no real bringing people back to covenant, which you read even in the New Testament. Think of the apostles and the epistles. When you read the epistles of the apostles, they are constantly doing this. They are bringing us back into this is what it looks like to be the people of God. As far as their character, think of Daniel was entirely blameless. The only way to get him thrown into that lion's den was by making up some rule that nobody ever followed before, and you know that he's not going to follow because he has too much zeal for the Lord. That's prophetic character. They just live by a different understanding of holiness and righteousness, and it's ingrained within them. That then leads to another thing that I would look at is formation. We don't have the story of every single prophet to show exactly how they were formed into their call. But what we do have is a consistent character by which we can analyze the question of what does it take to get someone to that point. There are things that we see repeated as patterns across multiple prophets that we can suggest these are things that might contribute, or they might even be patterns that every prophet experiences, but we can't make that a hard statement. Instead, with formation, what I'm looking for if I'm asking somebody questions to see if I think that they might truly be a prophet is I'm looking for how did the Lord shape the way they see? How did the Lord shape the way that they speak? How much credit do they give to the Lord for their words and for their understanding? Are they embodying humility that Moses could say he's the most humble man on all the earth, and yet that sounds like arrogance? What if that's actually the definition of humility, is to be able to recognize it and still be humble? Truth, when you think of David in the Psalms, he says, I want truth in the inward parts. Not just the fact that I would believe true things, but that truth itself would be embodied in me. That for people to even look at me, they can't deny the truth. Something about me is so categorically different that it challenges the way that they understand. An example off the top of my head is Stephen, his martyrdom. What happens in the very next chapter? At the end of the chapter, they laid the clothes at the feet of Saul. Next chapter, he's on the road to Damascus, and there's a light that flashes, and it's his conversion story. I'm not saying that Stephen's death created the salvation of Paul, but I am saying that something happened within that was such a statement of truth and reality that it went into the psyche of Saul. You can't experience that. You can't see that and just unsee it. There is something that Stephen embodied in truth and reality that I believe went into the conscience of this man, so that when he was on the road to Damascus, it gave way for the Lord to actually speak to him.